In this section, we are going to talk about consonant place of articulation. And the idea here is that, well, what is a consonant? A consonant is a sound made with some kind of significant constriction somewhere in the vocal tract. That's what makes it different from vowels. Vowels tend to have much less constriction in the vocal tract, although, vowels do have some degree of constriction, it's just that consonants tend to have greater degrees of constriction in the vocal tract. What is a constriction? It's anything that makes this tube going from your glottis to your lips and possibly up through your nose, anything that makes this tube more narrow anywhere in the vicinity of anything above the glottis is going to be a constriction. That's what a constriction is. And so in terms of aerodynamics, that's going to be some kind of an impediment to airflow, right? It doesn't mean that air can't get through. It just means that it's going to perturb the way that air flows through, or pressure really flows through this vocal tract, right? If there's an impediment to airflow, the way to do that is to change the shape of the vocal tract. That's what a constriction is. If you change the shape of this vocal tract by constricting it, it's going to change the resonant frequencies within this vocal tract. We'll talk more about acoustics in the next week, but this is what acoustic phonetics is all about. What happens to the way that pressure propagates through this tube, or the way that air bounces around up here when you change the shape of the vocal tract. That's what acoustics is about. So anytime you change the shape of the vocal tract, you're going to change its acoustic frequencies, resonant frequencies, and that's basically what people hear when they hear these things. We'll get into more detail about that next week. So as that English consonant chart suggests, although English is missing a couple of articulators that we'll talk about briefly, these consonant constrictions can happen just about anywhere in the vocal tract, right? And so I've repeated the sort of vocal tract diagram here. And as a brief review, let's go through these. So as I mentioned before, the English chart includes consonants from all the way at the front of the vocal tract, at the lips over here, all the way back to the bottom or the back of the vocal tract at the glottis down here. You see how my vocal tract drawing is getting better from week to week? I'm really improving here. Somebody's learning something this semester. That's good. So what do we have in the vocal tract? Well, places where consonants can be made. We start at the front. You can use your lips to make consonants, right? So you can independently move your upper lip and your lower lip. Your teeth can also be relevant here. You can make sounds with your teeth against one of your lips, with your teeth together, with your tongue tip touching your teeth. That's a possible way to make a sound. The tongue has at least 3 degrees of freedom. At least 3 bits of your tongue can be moved sort of mostly independently. Might be even more than that. So in general, in linguistics, for consonants, it's going to be important to distinguish different parts of the tongue. The entire front of the tongue is referred to as the corona, but more common is to refer to sounds as coronal sounds. That's basically involving the front of the tongue. We can further distinguish between the very, very tip of the tongue. We refer to those as apical sounds. And the blade of the tongue, which is the sort of sides and the area right behind that absolute tip of the tongue. Those are sometimes referred to as laminal sounds if you're using that area of your tongue blade. That's all part of the sort of front part of the tongue, the coronal area. You go back a little bit further, you get the tongue dorsum, or body, which is, roughly this middle part. And you can use that to make all sorts of sounds by maybe pulling it up towards your palate. Or some other kind of manipulation there. And then the back of the tongue, the bottom of your tongue that extends into your pharynx, which is this cavity here. This is an empty space, your pharynx. This is your tongue root. And sounds made at the tongue root are referred to as radical sounds. We're not going to spend a ton of time on those sounds in this class. There's no real radical sounds in English. So that's the tongue. And then, of course, going up here, you have different parts of the roof of your mouth. This bump just behind your upper teeth is your alveolar ridge. Consonants that are made there are alveolar. Behind that, you have the hard palate, which is roughly this part here, and those are going to be palatal sounds. You get back far enough, and that hard palate turns soft. Your soft palate is called your velum, And that's basically this whole back area of the roof of the mouth here. Those are velar sounds, right? The velum has this sort of tip called the uvula that hangs down when you're producing nasal sounds or when you're breathing, right? This hangs down and flaps in the back of your mouth. And normally when you're producing oral consonants, which, you know, most consonants are oral, this is going to be raised backwards and blocking off airflow between the oral and the nasal cavities. If you leave it hanging down low like this, then you get airflow through both the oral and the nasal cavity. Those are nasal sounds, right? And nasal sounds can be made with any other constriction anywhere in the vocal tract. Other places of articulation, radical sounds include pharyngeal sounds, which are sounds that create a constriction in your pharynx. Your pharynx is this basically column of air on top of your glottis. And then you can make consonants with your glottis as well. So the two most common sounds you get with a glottis are the glottal fricative, which is basically an H sound, and the glottal stop, which is a little bit tricky in English because it's probably not really a contrastive sound, but it's the sound that pops up in the middle of and the beginning of words like uh-oh, right? You know, so this is kind of an exclamation in English. And you can imagine that this would sound really weird if you dropped something and you said, oh, right? That's just not how you say that in English. It has a glottal stop. Uh-oh. That's what a glottal stop is like. Okay. So that's, again, the review of the vocal tract here. And so basically every area in the vocal tract is going to be a potential place of articulation where you might get different kinds of consonant sounds. In addition, usually when we're talking about consonants, it's useful to distinguish between different levels of place of articulation, from major place, which divides the vocal tract into 3 or 4 large parts, down to minor place, which talks about all the kind of little details that might pop up inside here. And so I've given this chart on page 2 of the consonant handout with major place up top, and then minor place subdivisions down below that. For some of these categories, you'll notice that the boundaries in the minor place row down below don't exactly match up with the boundaries in the major place row up top. And that's on purpose. That's trying to indicate that the sounds that go across those major place boundaries sometimes count as one major place and sometimes count as a different major place. It usually depends on the language, how the phonology treats these sounds. So in terms of major place, this is pretty straightforward. We can talk about labial sounds, which are broadly speaking, you know, those made with the lips, and that includes sounds made with the teeth and the lips together, where there's a constriction somewhere in this general labial area. We talk about coronal sounds, as I mentioned. That's sort of anything you do with the front of your tongue. We can talk about dorsal sounds, and that's anything you do with the middle area of your tongue here. And then, we can also talk about radical sounds, and in Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew, where these sounds are particularly common, they're traditionally referred to as guttural sounds. I'll probably use radical more often in this class, although we're not going to deal with a ton of radical sounds in this class. Anyway, so those would be the 4 major places of articulation, and in practice, because most languages don't have radical consonants, we're usually only really talking about 3 major places of articulation: labial, coronal, and dorsal. You can group together the coronal and dorsal sounds under the label lingual, meaning like of or pertaining to the tongue. You don't see that very often, but it does exist, so I just wanted to put it on the handout. And then the sort of more intricate details are down at the bottom here, so these are minor place distinctions. So within the labial category, we can distinguish between bilabial. These are sounds that are going to be made by bringing the 2 lips together, the upper lip and the lower lip, or sometimes by protruding those 2 lips to make a rounded shape. Rounded. So that's going to be a bilabial sound. In English, those would include sounds like p, b, m. You can also make a sound by bringing your lower teeth against your upper lip. that's referred to as a labiodental sound. Labio means lips, dental means teeth, and so a sound like f or v, v. If you make that sound, you'll feel that your lower teeth are probably touching or almost touching your upper lip there. That's a labiodental sound. Within the coronal major place of articulation, there's lots of little fine subdivisions that you can do with your tongue tip in this general area. And so the frontmost of those would generally be sticking your tongue tip right in between your two sets of teeth, making an interdental sound like th or the. Just behind that, we can talk about alveolar sounds. Those are the sounds that you make with your tongue tip near or touching your alveolar ridge, as in English ta and da and na, but not Spanish or Russian ta or da or na. Those are going to be different. Those would be more dental sounds. You'll see the word dental or the word interdental. They're pretty much used interchangeably in phonetics. Technically, maybe there's some small difference, but in general, those are going to mean the same thing, dental or interdental. These two sound places of articulation together, the dental place and the alveolar place, because they're further forward in the coronal area here, they're referred to as anterior, right? And that's to be contrasted with non-anterior coronal sounds. And those would consist of things that are made with the tongue tip further back in the vocal tract here. One of those possibilities would be retroflex consonants, and some people will tell you that English is a retroflex consonant. That's a little bit fuzzy or controversial. I'll talk about that in the next section. But a retroflex sound is one that you make by taking the tip of your tongue and curling it backwards so that it's making contact or approaching someplace further back in your vocal, on your palate, behind the alveolar ridge. There's a general kind of post-alveolar area that's relevant in English that includes sounds like sh and j and ch. And so that's going to be somewhere behind alveolar. The precise location of the constriction, as we'll see in the next section, is kind of variable and not easy to categorize, but it's going to be non-anterior post-alveolar, meaning behind the alveolar ridge somewhere. So beyond post-alveolar and retroflex sounds, we also have palatal sounds, and these tend to be made with the tongue blade up somewhere near the front of the hard palate. So you do get palatal consonants in many languages. English is generally not described as having any pure palatal consonants. But you will find these in other languages. I've put these spanning the boundary between the coronal area and the dorsal area because in some languages it looks like palatal sounds count as coronals, but in other languages they seem to count as dorsal consonants in ways that we're going to need to put off until we learn a little bit more about phonological features, right? So they're sometimes coronal, sometimes dorsal. I just made a mistake as well. It's not true that English doesn't have any pure palatal consonants. We have a glide consonant y, which is not very consonantal, but if you call that a consonant, that one is purely palatal, y. And that's made with your tongue blade sort of up near your hard palate, although not too close because it's a fairly wide vocal tract for that sound. Okay. Coming back further, we have velar sounds. These are made with your tongue body somewhere up near your velum here. That would include sounds like k and g in English. And then if you distinguish between the sort of front area of the velum and the very, very back here, this is your uvula. And sounds made with your tongue body back near this part of your velum are called uvular. There are no uvular sounds in English. This time I'm sure I'm not making a mistake. Really, English doesn't have any consistently uvular sounds. Other languages do. We'll take a look at that a little bit later. And I've also put uvular on the boundary here between the dorsal area of the tongue and the radical area of the tongue root. And that's because, again, in some languages, uvular sounds seem to count as basically dorsal. In other languages, they seem to count as basically radical or guttural. So notably, in most varieties of Arabic, these uvular sounds do count as radical in an important sense, which we won't learn about until next semester. But that's why, again, it's spanning the boundary here, because it can count either way in different languages. Within the radical or guttural class, we can further distinguish between pharyngeal sounds, and remember the pharynx is this empty cavity here behind the tongue root above the glottis. How do you make a pharyngeal sound? You back your tongue root into the pharynx, and that constricts the pharynx. Again, not so relevant for English. The only sound we have with a significant sort of pharyngeal constriction would actually be the vowel sound ah. And of course, again, that's not going to be a very tight constriction, but if you make an exaggerated version of that vowel, ah, you can probably feel your tongue root doing something. That's a pharyngeal constriction. And then, of course, we distinguish between pharyngeal sounds and glottal sounds. So you can make a constriction with your glottis. Well, one kind of constriction is to hold the glottis fully together and create voicing. That's generally not considered its own consonant sound. You can also press your vocal folds together even tighter so that no air can flow through and you block voicing, and then let it go. That's going to be a glottal stop. Or you can hold the vocal folds close enough together that it creates a significant constriction, but not close enough together to make voicing, and that's going to be a glottal fricative. All right, so you can make various kinds of constrictions with your glottis, and that's also a place of articulation, although the way that glottal works as a place of articulation in phonology is going to be a little bit interesting and different, and so we'll probably talk about that a bit later this semester. But that's the basic outline of consonant place of articulation. Again, get to know the vocal tract a little bit. Any location within your vocal tract here is a potential place of articulation where you can create some kind of a constriction using various, parts of your vocal tract. Any articulator that you move in here is referred to as an active articulator. Right? So all of these labels, coronal, dorsal, radical, labial, these are all going to be characterizations of active articulators, parts of your vocal tract that are moving. The places that they move to are referred to as passive articulators. So the minor places of articulation, like dental, alveolar, palatal, these are going to be passive articulators, right? Because you're not moving your hard palate, you're only moving the front of your tongue towards your hard palate or your alveolar ridge. The teeth can be either a passive or active articulator. It kind of depends on the sound, whether you're moving your teeth to get them in position or not. And that is consonant place of articulation in a nutshell.